Story 1. The Squatter Fiancé. It was one of those humid summer nights where the air felt too heavy to breathe, and the crickets outside seemed louder than usual. My boyfriend and I had just crawled into bed, ready to call it a night, when we heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. It wasn't the kind of knock you could ignore. It was persistent, demanding. "Who knocks on someone's door this late?" My boyfriend muttered, sitting up. "Stay here," I said, grabbing my phone as I walked toward the door. Through the peephole, I saw her. She looked vaguely familiar, a young woman, disheveled but composed enough to seem confident. Her makeup was smeared, her hair hung in loose strands, and she was gripping the porch railing as though steadying herself. "It's that woman," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Earlier that day, we'd seen her wandering around the property. She'd introduced herself as our landlord's fiancée, a claim that struck us as odd considering we'd seen him bringing home other women in the past. But we didn't think much of it at the time. Now, she was back. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. "I need a lighter," she said without so much as a greeting. Her voice was flat, her words slurred just enough to make me wonder if she'd been drinking. Hoping to end the encounter quickly, I handed her a lighter from the kitchen drawer, but instead of leaving, she leaned against the doorframe, her eyes darting past me as though she was trying to peer inside. "He's cheating on me, you know," she said suddenly. "Who is?" I asked, confused. "Your landlord," she replied, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He's at a hotel right now with some tramp. But don't worry, I'll take care of it." There was something unnervingly casual about the way she said it, as though this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with such a situation. "I really think you should go," I said, trying to keep my tone firm but polite. Her demeanor shifted in an instant. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're better than me? Huh?" she snapped. "You don't even take your trash bins out on time. You're white trash, and I'll make sure you're evicted if you don't get on my good side." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the night, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and the lighter still clutched in my hand. Over the next week, she became a constant, invasive presence in our lives. It started with strange noises in the middle of the night, footsteps in the backyard, the unmistakable creak of the shed door opening and closing. Then came the music, blaring at all hours from her side of the property, making it impossible to sleep. One night, I woke up to the sound of banging on the walls, as though someone was hitting them with a hammer. My boyfriend and I stared at each other in the dark, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what we both knew: it was her. "I'm calling the landlord," I said, grabbing my phone. But when we texted him, his response was frustratingly vague. "I'm handling it," he wrote, but he didn't explain who she was or why she was there. The turning point came one night when I glanced out the window and saw her standing in the middle of the backyard. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at our house with an unsettling stillness. "Do you think she's dangerous?" I asked my boyfriend, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, pulling me away from the window. The next morning, we found the shed door wide open, its contents strewn across the yard. A few tools were missing, but nothing of significant value. When we confronted our landlord again, he promised to take care of it, but still wouldn't tell us what was going on. It wasn't until nearly a month later that we finally got answers. Our landlord returned to the property looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him. He called us out to the porch, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands as he began to explain. "She's not my fiancée," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "She's a squatter." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. "What do you mean?" I asked, struggling to process what he was saying. He went on to explain that he'd met her through a dating app and gone on a few casual dates. She'd seemed normal at first, maybe a little quirky, but nothing alarming. Then, one night, she convinced him to let her stay over. "She never left," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "She keeps doing this, moving in, refusing to leave, making everyone's life hell until someone pays her to go." Apparently, this wasn't her first time pulling this stunt. She'd done it to other men, using charm, manipulation, and veiled threats to gain access to their homes and take over their lives. That night, the tension came to a head. It was just past midnight when we heard the now familiar sound of banging on the front door. This time, it wasn't just a knock, it was a relentless pounding, accompanied by her shrill voice screaming, "Let me in." My boyfriend called the landlord, who promised he was on his way. Meanwhile, I stood frozen by the door, watching her through the peephole. She was dragging a large garbage bag behind her, her movements erratic and desperate. When the landlord finally arrived, the confrontation was explosive. She hurled accusations and insults at him, her voice cracking with emotion. He tried to reason with her, but it was clear she wasn't going to back down. Eventually, he made her an offer. He would buy her a one-way bus ticket out of town if she agreed to leave that night. To our surprise, she accepted. The next morning, the house was quiet for the first time in weeks. Our landlord stopped by to let us know she'd left. He didn't share many details, only that she'd taken the money and boarded a bus to another state. "I'm sorry for everything," he said, his tone heavy with regret. We nodded, grateful but still shaken. Even after she was gone, her presence lingered in our minds. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the backyard, sent my heart racing. I couldn't stop wondering, how many other people had she done this to? How close had we come to something worse? The thought of her out there, somewhere, starting the cycle again, was enough to make my skin crawl. The experience left me with a lingering paranoia, a constant vigilance I couldn't shake. I told myself I'd never let someone manipulate their way into my life like that again. Story 2. The Bald Man in Post-Soviet Russia. In the late 1980s, the world felt big and lawless, especially to kids growing up in the crumbling remnants of the Soviet Union. The adults were preoccupied with survival, long lines for bread, whispers of political instability, and the occasional sirens that seemed to announce the collapse of yet another institution. For us kids, though, this chaotic world was a playground, and the abandoned buildings, rusting factories, and decaying neighborhoods were like giant treasure chests waiting to be explored. I was the youngest in a ragtag group of 5 boys, led by my older brother, Yuri. He was 15, lanky, and always looking for the next thrill to distract us from the monotony of post-Soviet life. On one particular day that started like any other, Yuri decided we'd explore the old textile factory on the edge of town. The factory was a relic from another time, its brick walls crumbling and its broken windows staring back at us like empty eyes. We'd heard stories about it, how it was once the pride of the city, employing thousands, before shutting down and being left to rot. It was perfect. "Bet there's still something cool in there," Yuri said, grinning as he slung his arm around my shoulder. I nodded, eager to impress him and the older boys. I was 11, and being included in their adventures made me feel invincible. We slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, our movements careful but swift. The factory loomed ahead, its towering smokestacks casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of damp concrete and rust, mingling with the faint scent of overgrown weeds that had reclaimed the courtyard. Inside, the factory was even more impressive. The cavernous space was filled with forgotten remnants of its former life, rusting machinery, piles of yellowed documents in Cyrillic, and twisted metal beams that had fallen from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through holes in the roof, giving the place an otherworldly glow. We wandered through the space, laughing and daring each other to climb the rickety stairs or crawl through tight spaces. Yuri found an old ledger and pretended to read it in a mock serious tone, making the rest of us double over with laughter. For a while, we were just kids, oblivious to the danger that lurked nearby. The sound of footsteps was the first sign that something was wrong. At first, we thought it was one of us. Someone had wandered off and was trying to sneak back to scare the others. But the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. "Who's there?" Yuri called out, his voice steady but loud enough to echo through the factory. No response. Then, from the shadows near a rusted conveyor belt, a man stepped into view. He was tall and bald, his head gleaming even in the dim light. He wore a long black trench coat that looked far too expensive for the decrepit surroundings. And his shoes were pristine, polished leather that shone with each step he took. "Hello, boys," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Something about him made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't just out of place, he was wrong. Like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit no matter how hard you tried to make it. Yuri stepped forward, shielding the rest of us with his body. "What do you want?" The man smiled, his thin lips curling into an expression that felt more like a sneer. "I was just walking by and heard some voices. Thought I'd say hello." None of us spoke. "You like my shoes?" he asked suddenly, lifting one foot slightly as if to show him off. Yuri didn't answer. "I have more," the man continued, his tone almost playful. "Come here, and I'll show you." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Yuri must have felt it too because he grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "That's okay," Yuri said. "We're leaving." The man's smile faltered for a moment before returning. Wider this time. "No need to rush off," he said. "It's not every day you meet someone like me." As he spoke, his coat shifted, and for a brief second, I saw it, the handle of a gun tucked into his waistband. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively stepped closer to Yuri. "Time to go," Yuri whispered, his voice so low only I could hear it. "Run," he said louder, this time for all of us to hear. We scattered in different directions, the factory's maze-like layout working both for and against us. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, my sneakers slapping against the cracked concrete floor. Behind me, I heard the man curse loudly, his boots pounding against the ground as he gave chase. I ducked behind a rusted piece of machinery, pressing myself against the cold metal as I struggled to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Through a gap in the machinery, I saw him pass by. His coat billowed behind him, and his hand hovered near the gun at his waist. His head turned sharply, his eyes scanning the shadows with a predatory intensity. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps moved away. When I finally emerged, Yuri was waiting for me near the entrance, his face pale but determined. "Everyone else got out," he said, grabbing my hand. "Come on." We sprinted toward the exit, the sunlight outside like a beacon calling us to safety. We didn't stop running until we were back in our neighborhood, gasping for air and trembling from the adrenaline. "What was his deal?" one of the boys asked, his voice shaky. Yuri didn't answer. He just shook his head, his jaw clenched tightly. A few weeks later, the news spread like wildfire. A child's body had been found in the factory. The details were horrifying. He'd been beaten to death, and the weapon, a blood-stained rock, had been left nearby. The description of the suspect was chillingly familiar: a tall, bald man in a black coat. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. If we hadn't run that day, one of us might have been the victim. The factory was boarded up after that, with guards posted to keep people away, but the damage had already been done. The memory of that man, the way he moved, the way he smiled, stayed with us long after the factory faded into obscurity. Even now, as an adult, I can't walk into an abandoned building without feeling that same cold dread. I still see his face in my nightmares, his eyes calculating and his smile dripping with malice. We were just kids, playing in a world that didn't care about our innocence. And though we escaped that day, the scars it left behind never really healed. After the encounter with the bald man, I thought I'd learned what it meant to sense danger, to know when to run. But not all threats are as obvious as a man with a gun. Sometimes, the danger is quieter, more insidious: a pair of footsteps too close behind you, a presence you can't shake no matter where you go. And sometimes, it doesn't chase you, it simply waits for you to let your guard down. Story 3. The Roommate from Hell. I never thought moving abroad for graduate school would be the setting for my worst nightmare. At first, it was everything I'd dreamed of: a chance to explore a new culture, meet interesting people, and gain some much-needed independence. I found a modest apartment close to campus, shared with 3 other students: Sam, Bella, and Poppy. From the moment I moved in, the 3 of them made me feel at home. Sam was sharp-tongued but funny, always the one to break tension with a witty comment. Bella was bubbly and full of energy, constantly inviting us out to cafes and markets. Poppy was the quieter one, always focused on her studies but sweet and thoughtful in her own way. It felt like I'd landed on my feet. Then there was Nellie. Her room was tucked at the end of the hall, near mine, and for the first 2 days, I barely saw her. Sam had warned me not to bother. "She's weird," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Trust me, you don't want to get too close." I wasn't the type to judge someone based on hearsay, so I brushed it off. But soon enough, I'd learned just how wrong I was. It was our second night together when I decided to introduce myself to Nellie. She hadn't come out to meet the rest of us, and I figured she might just be shy. I knocked gently on her door, half expecting no answer, but the door opened almost immediately, as if she'd been standing on the other side, waiting. She was shorter than I'd expected, with long, tangled brown hair that framed her pale face. Her wide eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and her lips curled into a small, unsettling smile. "I'm Nellie," she said, her voice soft and childlike. Her room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a desk lamp. Behind her, I caught glimpses of clutter, stacks of books, clothes strewn across the floor, and what looked like a collection of empty food containers on her desk. "We're having dinner in the kitchen," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You should join us." Her expression brightened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Okay," she said simply, stepping out into the hall without another word. At dinner, Nellie sat beside me, her chair pulled uncomfortably close. She didn't contribute much to the conversation, only speaking when someone asked her a direct question. Even then, her answers were short and cryptic. "What do you do for fun?" Bella asked, trying to include her. "I like to listen," Nellie replied, her eyes flicking toward me. "To music?" Bella pressed. Nellie shook her head, her smile widening. "Just listen." The room fell awkwardly silent, and Sam quickly changed the subject. After dinner, I offered to walk with Nellie to class the next day, thinking it might help her feel more included. She nodded eagerly, and for a moment, I felt like I was doing a good deed. But as the weeks went on, the small oddities began to pile up. The first red flag was the bathroom. Nellie and I shared it, and at first, I didn't think much of the occasional clog. But soon, it became a daily occurrence. The toilet would be stuffed with wads of toilet paper, sometimes overflowing, and always accompanied by long strands of brown hair. At first, I thought it was an accident, something she didn't realize she was doing. I even sent her a gentle message. "Hey Nelly, I think the toilet might be clogging easily. Maybe try flushing more often." She didn't reply, but the next morning, I found the bathroom in complete disarray. The toilet was not just clogged, it was overflowing onto the floor. Still, I didn't want to escalate things. I cleaned it up and hoped it wouldn't happen again. But it did, over and over. One morning, I woke up to find the entire bathroom covered in toilet paper and hair. It wasn't just careless, it was deliberate. I sent her another message, this time more direct. "Nelly, this is getting out of hand. Please stop clogging the toilet, or I'll have to report it." Her reply came hours later. "The cockroach doesn't complain when it's stepped on." I stared at the message, confused and unnerved. Around this time, a new issue arose, the smell. It started as a faint sourness wafting from Nelly's room, but over time, it became unbearable. It was sweet and rotten, like spoiled milk mixed with decaying meat. No matter how much we cleaned the apartment, the stench persisted. Sam joked that Nelly was probably keeping a dead animal in her room. But none of us really wanted to find out. Then came the night I found the bathroom smeared with feces and blood. The sight of it made me gag, my stomach turning as I stumbled back into the hallway. It wasn't just the mess, it was the deliberate way it had been spread across the walls. Like some grotesque piece of art. I texted Nelly immediately, my fingers shaking. "What the hell is wrong with you? Clean this up now." Her response was almost instantaneous. "The cockroach screams when its wings are torn. Don't be the cockroach." After that, I tried to avoid Nelly as much as possible, but she made it impossible. She began standing outside my room at night, whispering or chirping like a bird. Sometimes, she'd rattle the doorknob or send me cryptic texts at odd hours. One night, I woke up to find her shadow visible under the crack of my door. "Why won't you talk to me?" she whispered. I didn't respond, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. The final straw came when we found the dead bird in the kitchen. Its body was splayed out on the floor, its wings outstretched, and its head missing. A pool of congealed blood surrounded it, and a trail of feathers led straight to Nellie's door. Sam was the one who found it, her face pale as she called me into the room. "She's gone too far," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to do something." I went to the school's safety office the next day, bringing photos and messages as evidence. They promised to investigate, and within a week, Nellie was removed from the apartment. But the relief was short-lived. Despite everything, the school only gave Nellie a behavioral warning. She wasn't expelled, and I later learned she had been placed in another dorm. She hasn't broken any laws. The safety officer explained, "We can't take further action without more evidence." It felt like a betrayal. I moved out soon after, finding a studio apartment where I could finally sleep without fear. But the trauma lingered. Even now, I can't hear the sound of chirping birds without thinking of Nellie. I keep my doors locked at all times, and every creak or shadow sends a jolt of panic through me. Nellie may be gone, but the fear she left behind will stay with me forever. Living with Nellie taught me that danger doesn't always come from strangers. It can come from the people closest to you. But it wasn't the first time I'd learned that lesson. Years earlier, as a child, I experienced another kind of terror. My family and I barricaded ourselves in my sister's room, hiding from a man who wouldn't leave. Even after she was gone, the house never felt the same. Every time I passed by the shed, I imagined her standing there in the darkness, watching. Every night, I found myself double-checking the locks, peering out the window, expecting to see her silhouette lurking in the backyard again. We tried to move on, but something about the way she left never sat right with me. Then, 2 months later, I saw the landlord's car in the driveway again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Through the blinds, I watched as he stepped out, a new woman trailing behind him. She was younger, bright-eyed, just like the ones before. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. I wanted to warn her. I wanted to tell her to run. But before I could, she turned her head slightly toward my window. And in that moment, I saw something that made my stomach drop. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an innocent one. It was her smile. What do you think? Was she really gone? Or did she just find a new way in? Let me know in the comments. And if you love hearing these eerie, real-life horror stories, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells, because trust me, some doors should never be opened.